So this week the topic is migration, immigration, and I found this piece of data on the web saying that the United Nations says that the number of immigrants have increased by 80 million in the last 25 years. And I just want people to really think about data. When you see data or you see maps, it's really important to try and figure out, does that make sense? And, what does that mean? 80 million immigrants. Well, I don't know. Yeah, I just kind of made me stop and wonder about, was that a significant number? I guess it is because they're reporting it. But so sometimes when you think about data, it's interesting to compare apples and apples. And so one way to do that was to determine, again from the web, what was the population in 1995 and what was the population in 2013, and then to look at the difference in population and what percent increase had we had in population in those 25 years. So population increased almost 20%. And then I looked at their data they gave us for number of immigrants and determined what the percent of increase in migrants was, and that was 33%. So, if I had done that and gotten that there were 21% an increase in migrants, that would have meant, it's really the same rate of immigration. But this means that there was, about 13% higher numbers of immigrants over and above the population change. It's a really good idea to kind of sometimes stop and look at data and try to figure out what you think it means. So the reading talked about the push and pull factors, and in general, people are motivated by the push factors. So there's something in their homeland that causes them to be dissatisfied or makes them want to find something different, and then the pull factor would be the place that they would go to address that need. It rarely starts with a pull. People don't wake up and say, I want to disrupt my entire life. I want to take my family. I want to move to a place where I can't speak the language very well, where all of the customs are different, and start over. Usually there has to be some pretty significant push. And these could be economic pushes. These can be safety, environmental pushes. The reading talked about several different reasons that people are pushed out of their home. And then the pull factors are, do you know somebody there already? What are the legal issues related to immigration? Can you go there? What have you heard? What's on the internet? What is your perceptions of a place? And so those are the things that would cause somebody to go, and also how close is it? So in the reading we talked about the laws of immigration, where people tend to move someplace close. So those are some of the causes. Then when we look at types of migration, we can look at these two categories of internal or international. So, of course, international is across political borders, and internal is within a country. And then we can also look at immigration as two categories of motivation. Was it forced or is it voluntary? So when we look at voluntary movement, you can look at these three types of voluntary movement with respect to the amount of time spent in the new place. And so this idea of cyclic migration. So cyclic migration has a shorter time period, so it could be just commuting. There are people that live in Oregon and commute to Washington, D.C. Politicians do that. They might be there for a couple months and then they come back to their home state. There might be people who work in, when we watched the video of an opera where the woman lived on the one side of the border and then would go into the U.S. to work and then come back. Nomadic is where there is not a consistent location. So people would move. These tend to be very remote groups of people, and it's more moving because of survival. And then seasonal. where people would just kind of shift with seasons. That's pretty obvious. And then there's periodic, which is a little bit longer time. Migrant labor would be in this category. Transhumance, which in class, when I gave this lecture, I had those two somewhat switched with nomadic. But transhumance is more what you see in the United States with cattle farming, where the animals will be in the mountains in the summer where it's cooler, and down in the valley in the winter where they can be protected. And then military service is another periodic example. And then all the way down to the bottom of permanent migration. So if we look at the map of 2013 estimates for migration, you see that the blue circles are immigrants, so people leaving their country, and the brownish orange are immigrants, numbers of people coming in, and the size of the circle indicates the numbers. So we can kind of look at this. Western Europe is a destination for the majority of people, and then U.S. and Canada is a destination. We can see a lot of activity here in the Middle East, a lot of activity in Central and in Central America and the Caribbean, and then large paths of immigration out of China. So there's a kind of a general pattern. So if you had to talk about and you will on an exam, if I asked you what is the general pattern of immigration and emigration, you might say that in general, in Africa, most of the countries are emigrating more than they're immigrating. So those are developing countries. And then due to activity in the Middle East, there's a lot of immigration. And most of the location or the arrival countries are in Western Europe and in North America, excluding Mexico. So you can kind of just summarize in general this pattern of movement of people. There is a map that you're going to use. Oh shoot, I'm going to see if I can get this small enough because I shrunk down the PowerPoint. Let me see if this will work. Ooh, maybe not. Let me try. We can look at it a little bit. So you're going to use this map for the assignment this week. So let's say if I click on Mexico and do arrivals, it shows me the location of where people are coming from. Now, it doesn't tell me what type of voluntary migration. Is it cyclic? Is it periodic? Is it permanent? It just tells me this number of people are coming from these places. And so you can look at the United States, Guatemala. So these are the two heaviest, both north and south of Mexico. There are a lot of people coming in from Spain, and then a fair number from Germany, France, and Canada. So looking at that, you might think about people who are coming to Mexico for vacation, people who are coming to Mexico to do part-time retirement. There's many people, especially in the U.S., who have retired in places in Mexico because the cost of living is so much less expensive and they're drawing their pensions here. And then in Guatemala, these might be people doing step migration up through Mexico into the U.S. So economically, if you were to look at this map and then look at the map of the Human Development Index or life expectancy, you really could see which places maybe are moving as a result of some need to permanently migrate and which are maybe using that as a temporary or vacation spot. Then you can click over here on departures and you can see where Mexicans are going. It was just fascinating to us in class to look at, the United States was expected, but Pakistan, that is a fascinating situation. Why are so many people? Oh, this is very cool. Look at this. So if I hover over here, daggone it, this small screen thing, it gives me the GDP, which you can't see because, okay. So if I look at Pakistan, the GDP is $881. If I look at Mexico, the GDP is $9,000. The U.S., the GDP is $46,000. So very, very interesting. You can get a lot of data from this map. So you're going to look at those relationships. And I've shut the PowerPoint. Let's get that back up. Okay. The directions will lead you to that map, and then you're also going to go to the CIA World Factbook to get some more current data. And yeah, so this is only 2007. So we've had several waves of immigration or periods of immigration. Obviously, the first was colonial immigration. Most of that was voluntary from England, and of course, voluntary is relative. People were not immigrating because things were rosy in England. Most people were hoping to have a better life and a better situation. There was involuntary migration when related to the slave trade in the U.S., and then there was also involuntary migration or forced migration of internal migration from relocation of the Cherokee Nation and other Native American nations at the time. But I think the largest kind of wholesale migration of a people was the Cherokee Nation, and you can see that it had disastrous consequences for those people. We had the first real peak of immigration was in the 1840s and 50s. About 4.3 million immigrants came in, mostly from Northern and Western Europe. So people from Britain and Germany were pretty much well accepted as immigrants. They were seen more like the dominant culture or the parent culture. Immigrants from Ireland and China, however, faced much different circumstances. At the time, Britain was, Ireland had been going through the potato famine and catastrophic starvation rates in Ireland at the time, and they were treated very badly by the British. And so, America was kind of the holy grail of trying to get your life on track. The Irish, I think, there was 750,000 people starved to death as a result of that famine, and so many people moved to the U.S. About half that Irish population immigrated to the U.S. at that time, and so did the same number of Germans. But here you see the political cartoons of the day. Very anti-Irish immigrant. So they're showing Irish as kind of monkey-like, overweight, drunken, violent, and they're also showing them as much more like African Americans than the European culture. So this is a common practice in all governments, used to kind of dehumanize or to deride a population so that it's easier to have different treatment. So in the 1850s, 1880s, the Chinese began to arrive in the U.S. It was political unrest and economic pressure, had Chinese immigrants move in at that time. And they too were subject to many kind of disparaging political cartoons, and here's one kind of showing the two big fears of the Irish and the Chinese, both of them as just very obscene caricatures, taking over the U.S. They're on either side, and you're looking south. This bothered me because I always think of up as north, and so this map or this image is somewhat flipped, so that the Irish man is on the east coast, the Chinese man is on the west coast. We're looking south down the Mississippi River, and these two immigrant groups are going to take over the country. And so that was, a common fear, and there were many laws passed to prohibit Chinese immigration. When we look at a map of U.S. ethnicity or ancestry, you can see that, I don't know if you can actually see that, but anyway, German is the light blue, and that is the dominant ancestry in the U.S. They came at the same time as the Irish, but they had wealth and means to buy land, to get set up, and the Irish then are pretty much relegated to that eastern seaboard in ethnic neighborhoods and ethnic populations where they originally settled because they did not have funds to kind of relocate in a different way. The second peak of immigration started after the Civil War. Who would want to come to a country at war with itself? And so from about that time on, we were getting about 500,000 people a year. Again, mostly people from Northern and Western Europe. So the third wave of immigration was at the time of the Industrial Revolution, and this saw immigrants coming from a different part of the world that were not predominantly Protestant, that were not light-skinned, blue-eyed. These were the Southern Europeans, the Greeks, the Italians, so Catholic. Of course, the Irish were Catholic, but this was Catholic plus darker-skinned, different cultures, and Eastern Europe, Poles and Russians. And so again, that shift was a result of the Industrial Revolution, where people were put out of jobs. You didn't need as many people, as many hands in a factory, and so the group immigrated to the U.S. and that reception was not great either. So the fourth wave has been since the Great Depression and World War II, and predominantly people coming from Latin America, Mexico, the Caribbean, etc., and then people coming in from Asia, Chinese, Indian, Southeast Asia. And so that was kind of our next group of immigration. So when you look at this graph, you can really see kind of the huge influence of Northern and Western Europe, from the 1830s to about 1930s. So for 100 years, that was the kind of the dominant group of people. And then in 1910, you see a spike of the Southern Eastern European group, and then it levels off. We kind of right before the Second World War, and the Depression in 29, nobody was moving anywhere. And then after that, after the World War II, you see this Latin American and Asian group immigrating. So it would be great to be able to, on an exam, talk about this graph and what was happening culturally in the world or in the U.S. that caused the peaks and valleys, and then maybe be able to talk about some of the reception of some of these groups. We've had immigration laws have changed over time. So at the height of the Chinese immigration, we instituted the Chinese Exclusion Act, where we were not allowed to have anybody immigrating who was Chinese. The Immigration Act of 65, we had some country quotas prior to that, and those were limited. In the 80s, we standardized our refugee policy to the UN International Refugee Policy. In the 90s, we tried to establish a diversity lottery so that we were getting people from many different areas. And then we've had guest worker programs. This is really common right now in Western Europe and the Middle East. Italy has many guest worker programs, and it's been suggested off and on as a way to address some of the immigration problems or concerns that people have currently. In World War II, there was, during and after, a program that was a guest worker program called the Bracero program, and this was contracted farm laborers. So when we look at internal migration, you can look at this map of the United States, and you can see that the dark blue color indicates states or counties, actually, that have lost population between 2006 and 2014. And then the medium-sized blue is counties that gained population. So you can get a sense of kind of the movement, much more movement out of the middle of the country. And part of that looks bigger because some of these counties are bigger. But so they take up more space on the map and they look larger. But this is also possibly related to the movement from rural to urban areas. You can see some darker colors here where this area of the country is strong industrially, and in southeast Texas there's a lot of jobs and there's a lot of industrial development, and so you see migration into those areas. So internal migration has been happening since the country began. We had this kind of gold rush and move along the Oregon Trail trying to settle the country. In the 90s, there was a wholesale movement of jobs out of the Great Lakes area. It's called the Rust Belt. So many of those factories, especially steel and automotive factories, were getting old. Labor was expensive, and so many companies closed those old factories and moved down to places like Georgia, South and North Carolina, and rebuilt factories that were more modern. And also there was a big labor pool that was less expensive. You also have people who are considered snowbirds. These are retired people who might live in the cold north in New England or in Minnesota in the Midwest, and then move to typically Florida or Arizona in the winter in the cold months. So you get that kind of periodic shift of migration. There's been a large movement of rural to urban across the country. Part of this is that industrialization, so that not only did factories industrialize, but farms industrialized. So when we think of the U.S. as a farming country, I think we really have no more than about 2% of the population is living off the land or making their living from farms. So many people left the farms to get jobs. Many people were thinking that cities were where they could have more education and more opportunities. And in many developing countries, you begin to see this wholesale abandonment of the countryside and moving into urban areas, and that is a huge increase in urbanization that has kind of some inherent problems with it, as the infrastructure of many of these cities aren't ready to receive that many immigrants. After World War II, there was a mass urban to suburban migration. This was in part due to the GI Bill after World War II. Soldiers who had served were given credits for college or money to go to college, and also home loans were made accessible. And so that American dream of having your own house and your own land, and also the development of the automobile being every house could have a car. So then you can't do that in the city, although we try. So people moved to these suburban areas. Often you'll see places where you have counter-urbanization. So that's kind of moving back to the city. Moving out of the city. So that would be part of that original suburban area. But it's also been a trend since the 90s, kind of as suburbs, you need a newer house or a bigger house, and we tend to have this big urban sprawl. as a condition also of retirees wanting to go to a new community, or people called lifestyle migrants. They want a bigger house. It's times people used to get a new car every 2 years, and then for a long time people would move up in houses. House prices, you could make so much money after about 3 or 4 years that you could sell and put your increase in your house value into the next house. So Ravenstein has the law of migration, and so there's kind of 5 things to think about. That with every migration, there's kind of a return migration in the other direction, and we saw that with the interactive map looking at people coming and going. Most migrants move only a short distance. We saw that in Mexico to the U.S. or Guatemala into Mexico. If it's a longer migration, people are going to tend to enter in big cities instead of small towns. Part of that's because they'll be taking maybe airlines or ship travel, and those would only dock in a big city, and so people would tend to stay where they would dock. Urban migration tends to be less migratory, so if you're in an urban area already, you're not going to move, and part of that is that wholesale rural to urban migration worldwide. And families in general are less likely to relocate than young adults, and that is also just with voluntary migration. There's another theory called the gravity model of migration, and this is a mathematical formula that's used to try to identify how much interaction will occur between 2 places. And the idea is that if there's a place that's large, more important, and a smaller place, that there will be interaction between those, or 2 large places, there will be interaction between those, and that the movement will diminish between places as the distance grows. So on an exam, I'm not going to ask you to talk about the gravity model other than just to know what the function of it is. One of the problems with migration for the immigrant country is brain drain. And so in the U.S., we often would give preference to an immigrant who has skills that we need. And this could be, for a long time, we were bringing in medical personnel, we were bringing in engineers, scientists, and during World War II, we immigrated many German scientists who were none too happy to leave the country at the time. But, and so in general, about 1/4 of all immigrants have a master's degree or higher. And that's kind of fascinating that as far as U.S. citizens, only about 1 out of 10 native-born Americans have a graduate degree. So it's good for the country that's receiving people, because these are people who can solve problems, that can create innovation, but it's really a detriment to the sending country, which means that they're losing their brains. They're losing people who can help the country develop and compete. Another concept in international migration, and probably internal as well, is this idea of chain migration. And this is the idea that when somebody immigrates, they're being helped by someone they know in the new country. And so in Eugene, there's a restaurant called the Hong Kong restaurant, and the man and woman who started that restaurant came from China, and over the years they have helped sponsor family members. And so when a family member comes over, they can work in the restaurant, they can put them up for a little time and get them situated. And then the book talked about step migration. And step migration is just that incremental movement that people will make. So you might move from Mexico right over the border into Texas, and then within a year or so you hear of a better job or something else maybe that would situate you a little better, and you would move, or you might need to make enough money and get the language and the culture down, and then you can make the next move. So often people who migrate may have several processes of step migration until they get more settled. And so that brings in the concept we talked about last week as far as ethnic neighborhoods, ethnoburbs, and ghettos. And this idea that when immigrants come in to large cities, usually there is an ethnic neighborhood and they will settle together. And eventually, once that person gets established, they might move out into a suburb that has a predominant ethnic population similar to their own. This is very different from ghettos, and so if you're unclear about how ghettos fit into that, you need to take another look at that in the reading or in the lectures, because neighborhoods and ethnoburbs are voluntary living situations, and so that would be a major difference. And also, they're not inherently poor or distressed. So I wanted to talk a little bit then from the concept of voluntary migration to refugees. And so the UNHCR has identified specific conditions to be considered a refugee. One is that you can document that you are being persecuted for race, religion, nationality, group membership, social or political. You are outside your country, so you have to get out of your country to be a refugee. You can't be in your country and claim that you're a refugee. So the people right now that are leaving Syria have to go through Turkey, and once they're in Turkey, then they could be considered a refugee. You have to not be able to get protection from your country, or you're unwilling because it's unsafe, right? I have no idea what I wrote here, but we're going to just skip over that. And then conditions where you cannot be considered a refugee. So, you know, if you asked for protection in your country, said they would protect you. If you went back to your country and reacquired your nationality, or if you have a new nationality from somewhere else. If you committed a war crime, you cannot, and you're in jeopardy of being killed because you committed a war crime, you cannot get a refugee status. Or if you've committed a non-political crime outside the country, you can't expect to be protected inside as a refugee. And then to finish this section up, the idea that refugees' journeys are usually very dangerous and very quick, and in the most part have very little with them. They don't have their paperwork, they don't have documentation, they can't prove that they're citizens of a country, they may not have passports. I think people in Syria, that conflict has been going on long enough that maybe some of these people are prepared, but when you're trying to swim or get in a lifeboat that's sinking and trying to swim the last little bit, I'm sure that any documentation or backpacks or whatever you have are being left behind. And many of these journeys are taken on foot, in bike or in wagon. So that is kind of a summary of the topic. There'll be a little more discussion about some current events in the next video.